effort. I'm Dale Neuman. I'm Director of the Harry S. Truman Center for Governmental Affairs here at UMKC. We're the co-sponsor, along with Pi Sigma Alpha, the Political Science Honor Society, the chapter at UMKC. And we want to thank them for their help. They were out handing out parking tags to help you avoid parking tickets, and it was through their good offices that we were able to get this venue, because students control the best venues on campus, and we applaud them for their energy in helping us get this. A couple of ground rules for this evening. I'm going to make an introduction or two. Our speaker will speak. There will be a question and answer. We've got a couple of microphones. If you have questions you want to ask the speaker, you might want to present yourself to the microphone and ask your question. That'll be easier for everybody to hear, and it will also then record more nicely on the video that we're making of this event, because the video of this event within several weeks will be up on the website of the Truman Center at UMKC. Without further ado, I'd like to introduce the person who's going to introduce the speaker. We have here today to introduce our speaker, Ambassador Alan Katz. He was ambassador to Portugal before he came to UMKC and joined our faculty in political science and public affairs. He has known our speaker for some time, and so we want him to make good remarks on her behalf to introduce her to us. Alan?
Good afternoon. I will make these mercifully brief because the main reason that you're here is to hear from Ambassador DiCarlo. Let me just sort of say this, that Rosemary has served at a long and distinguished career with the Department of State. As someone who spent only 3.5 years of his life dealing with the Department of State, I admire her tenacity and her ability to overcome shall we say, large obstacles with a single gun. But she was known throughout the department as an outstanding diplomat. She had 2 tenures in her service at the United Nations. Our association came on in sort of an unusual way. We found ourselves on the same panel for the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, which was part of that wonderful confirmation process that anyone who's an ambassador has the honor of going through. The Senate, in their wisdom, confirmed her long before they confirmed me, and she went on to serve in one of the 5 ambassadorships that sits at the United Nations. Most people are only aware of the one. Susan Rice was the ambassador, the permanent representative of the UN at the time, but there are 4 other ambassadorships. There's 4, isn't it? What is not generally as well known, nor of great interest to anyone except for me, is that I was supposed to be in one of those positions, which meant I would have been serving alongside of Rosemary, but facts, situations intervened, and I wound up as ambassador to Portugal. And Susan Rice was fond of pointing out to me I got a much better deal. But in any event, I think what's important to understand is this, is that I had the opportunity to work with Ambassador DiCarlo because while I was ambassador to Portugal, they served on the Security Council. And they served on the Security Council at a particularly difficult time on a number of difficult issues, particularly as they involved the Middle East. And it was well known throughout the diplomatic community that if there was a crisis that you needed to deal with someone at the UN, Ambassador DiCarlo was the place that she would start because she had the breadth of understanding and the knowledge and the background to give you very good advice that would be very helpful. So, without further ado, let me present to you recently retired, but nonetheless someone who will be doing many more things, I'm sure, for our country, Ambassador Rosemary DiCarlo.
Thank you. I gather I'm speaking to this mic that's attached to me, not to, oh, that one's working too. All right, okay, thank you. Yes, as Ambassador Katz said, we went through confirmation hearings together, which is something everyone should do once in a lifetime, I must say. Having those lights blare at you as if you're somehow on trial or being interrogated in some police station, when really what you're just trying to do is get the job that the president nominated you to do, is a very daunting experience. I had 30 wonderful years in the Foreign Service, and I encourage all of you who are thinking of a career in international affairs to consider the Foreign Service. It's not easy in the sense that you do move around a lot, hard for families, certainly, but it is perhaps one of the most rewarding things you can do. I mean, representing your country abroad or before foreigners is just frankly immensely rewarding. I was very lucky. I had some great assignments. Frankly, of my 30 years, I think there was only 1 year where I felt sure I really grooved to this assignment that I'm doing this time around. Everything else was great, and it got better and better. And I served twice in Moscow, which was fantastic. I was there in the Soviet period, and then I was there when Boris Yeltsin was president. I served, my first assignment was in Norway. I served twice at the United Nations. I served at the National Security Council. I worked on Balkan issues twice, once during the Kosovo conflict, and then later when Kosovo actually became independent. That was a great, fascinating experience. It's also the time when we got countries like Albania and Croatia into NATO, which was also very rewarding. But I have to say the last 6 years that I've spent at the United Nations has been really fantastic. Now, before I joined the Foreign Service, I worked in the UN system. I worked for a few years in Paris at UNESCO. Primarily because I wanted to be in Paris. I have to admit it. But I grew to like the UN, and it was a crazy time. UNESCO was undergoing a very difficult period, known for its mismanagement. It was at a period when the United States left the organization, the United Kingdom left the organization, and then Singapore followed us as well. More for economic reasons than political, decided that if two big countries didn't think it was worth being part of UNESCO, that why should Singapore spend its money in joining an organization that the United States didn't think was important. We're now back in UNESCO, as you know, but with a few other problems. But I have to say that, you know, going sort of full circle and then coming back to the UN at the end of my career has been fantastic. Now, at the UN, we do have 5 ambassadors. We have the top person, who is almost always a political appointee. Of the other 4 ambassadors, 1 or 2 at any given time are career, like me. I do want to stress that over the last few years, of the 5 ambassadors, 3 were women. We're having some changes in the mission. I've departed now. I've decided that I've been in government 30 years, time to try something else, or at least try something that doesn't occupy 80 hours a week. Another person has left, and if the Senate confirms the president's nominees, we'll have 4 of our 5 females. So for those of you women who are interested in this kind of work, just be aware you can rise to the top. There isn't a glass ceiling anymore. Working at the UN is fabulous. You can do many things at the United Nations. You can't do everything. Okay, and no country approaches the United Nations as the be-all and the end-all. Every country is there to promote its own interests. That's what government officials are paid to do. It's what a Foreign Service officer is paid to do, is to protect and promote the interests of the United States. And sometimes, some things you can do well at the UN. Sometimes you can fail miserably, or it's better not to try, to be perfectly honest, because it's not going to work. Now, I don't know where all of you are from. I know we have 1 person from Venezuela, 1 from Tajikistan, 1 from Germany, Georgia. Other countries here? Yes? Senegal, okay. Bangladesh, yeah? Mongolia, great. Well, I think you will find that every country approaches it in a certain way. Now, we have certain priorities. Other countries have different priorities. Example. One of our major priorities is proliferation of weapons of mass destruction. And you hear us talk a lot about a nuclear Iran or a nuclear North Korea. We've passed resolutions at the UN. It's been extremely important to us to not only get those resolutions adopted, but to have every country in the UN adhere to those provisions. But I have to be very clear that if you want other countries to support your priority, you've got to support theirs. You simply can't, this is not, this is not a bilateral relationship, this is a multilateral relationship. And you have to understand that the Pacific Islands are undergoing huge changes now and are terribly concerned about climate change. I'm not saying we're not concerned about climate change, we are. We have a more difficult time with climate change. On the other hand, if we're not listening to the concerns of the Pacific Islands and some of the things that they are facing, we're not going to have them supporting us on the things that we think are important. So it's give and take. It's a lot of give and take. And it's give and take in various areas because you've got concerns of the Pacific Islands here, and then maybe you have concerns of countries in the Middle East there, and you have a lot of concerns of African countries that you've got to take into consideration and try to move forward. That's one thing I want to say about it. The second thing is it's a place where you build coalitions, even if you don't call them coalitions, coalitions of the willing, coalitions in the Gulf War. Basically, you're forming a bond with like-minded countries on a certain issue. Now, the difference is that in the course of even a day, you'd be surprised who's your bedfellow, if you will, on an issue, and that in the morning you could be having a meeting on Syria and you're sitting there with the Gulf states and you are the like-minded countries on how to deal with Syria. In the afternoon you might be having a meeting on LGBT rights, and I can assure you there won't be anybody from the Gulf states in that meeting. So you've got a different cast of characters who are your coalition partners, if you will, on that issue. And what you find out is often that, just give you a case in point, Russia. Some of us were talking about Russia before we started the formal segment. There are times when we are terribly at odds with the Russians on Ukraine, on Syria, on some of the social issues, even human rights related. And then there are times when we are in lockstep. Terrorism. They're also concerned about proliferation. They're very concerned about the integrity of the institution of the UN. So basically, what you have to bear in mind is that your adversary today is likely or could be your best ally tomorrow on a different issue. So I've got to keep those relationships always at an even keel, always. Now, what are the issues that have consumed us over the last, let's just say last year. Last year has probably been the toughest of my 6 years there, because it seemed as if the world was exploding. I mean, first it was all Syria. Then all of a sudden, Ukraine. I mean, who thought we were going to have these problems in Ukraine? Who thought the Russians were going to go in and annex Crimea? Changing what is a post-Cold War order. So we scramble to try to deal with that. That's not an issue, by the way, one can deal with very well at the United Nations. The Russians have a veto in the Security Council. Any more than we could deal with Georgia particularly well, and had to kind of move it out and do it in sort of a smaller grouping and not do it where we would constantly be fighting the Russians and neither one of us winning at the end. What else? Now it's Iraq. It's the threat of terrorism, a new kind of terrorism, a new form of terrorism. And we see it not only in Iraq, but look at Nigeria with Boko Haram. You have terrorists who are trying to take over territory now. It's a little different from Al-Qaeda. Not that Al-Qaeda wasn't dangerous in itself. We have other issues that keep cropping up. Certainly, we have the problem of the Central African Republic that was ready to implode. South Sudan, our pride and the newest nation, and the U.S. was front and center in helping to broker the comprehensive peace agreement between North and South that would allow for finally ending 20 years of bloodshed. And then, what do we have? We have problems again in South Sudan among the various groups. So different things that kept affecting us most of the time. But then again, let's go to, I'm talking about the hard security here. Let's talk about some of the other issues. If you're from, again, the Pacific Islands, you're not really worried about the Central African Republic. You're not even worried about Ukraine. You're worried about climate change. If you're from certain parts of Africa, what are you worried about? You're worried about development. You're worried about poverty. You're worried about the fact that small arms come across your border day in and day out and aren't stopped. I mean, these are issues that are critically important to the survival of some of these countries. You're worried about infectious diseases, as people are today. So you've got to be able to work on a range of these and understand that there are many, many aspects that are threats to international peace and security. And why are we there? Why are we part of the UN? We're part of the UN to maintain security in the world, peace and security. We're there to make life better for everybody. It can mean different things, and it can mean different things to different nations, but in the end, we've got to work together and come up with the best deal, if you will, that we can while we do work together. Not easy with 193 countries as members. Very different points of view among some. And then in some cases, lots of convergences. You've got to find those convergences and work them, and then hopefully try then to work on the areas where the convergence isn't as great. I'm going to stop there, and I think I'd really be interested in your comments or questions.
Thank you for coming here to speak with us. I'm actually interested in joining the Foreign Service, and my question is, out of all the challenges you face in the Foreign Service, which one has been the most difficult to deal with, essentially?
I mean, I think for me the most difficult challenge to deal with is the personal one. And the fact that if you have a two-career family, for example, it's very hard to match it up. And therefore, I've always put family first in my career. I think it's important. My husband has done the same. And I don't think in the end, I don't think it hurt us, but certain choices would have been different. I know a lot of people might answer this question with, well, it's very hard sometimes to be supporting a policy that one doesn't agree with. And what I would say to that is, you know, far be it for me to ever second guess the President of the United States. No matter who it is. Yeah.
Other questions for our speakers?
I also would like to join the Foreign Service, but I'm gay, and I'm wondering how that would affect what my assignments could be if I make it into the service.
I don't think it would affect your assignments at all. Many of my colleagues who are at the mission in New York also are gay, members of the gay community. They served in the Middle East, they served in Africa, they served in Europe, they've served everywhere. And I think that you would find that the State Department has a very good policy on this issue, and frankly, we don't accept the fact that someone else's culture might not accept different values that we might have. Marie, so I would encourage you, keep at it, move forward.
As well, I'm also interested in the Foreign Service, and I was wondering what would be your biggest piece of advice to getting into the Foreign Service?
First of all, I think it's important if you want to join the Foreign Service, I think it's very important to know languages. I know you can learn languages once you're in the service. They send you to something called the Foreign Service Institute and drill you for 6 to 10 months, depending on how hard the language is. But it's very useful to come in with languages. You're considered a hot commodity if you've already got at least one language under your belt, particularly a language that is either spoken by many people, like Chinese, or a language that is spoken by quite a number of countries, like Spanish. So I think that part is important. And as far as, you know, as a career in the Foreign Service, what I would say is that it's most important to do what you like doing and what you think you're good at. Not mapping out a career thinking that if I do this is career enhancing, and someone tells me I should then go to this region because that will add to my CV, and then back to this region and so forth. No, you should do what you like and what you're good at, because that is what will help you move forward and make you happy.
I was kind of interested in hearing more what the Foreign Services does, so I'm just wondering what activities do they do?
Okay, a number of different things. First of all, we have, usually when you join the Foreign Service, you get channeled into what they call a cone initially. Everybody does for a first tour consular work, and that is you issue visas. You issue visas to foreigners who want to come here, and you deal with American citizen services abroad. That's your first tour. And it may sound boring. It's not boring, and it can be really difficult and painful. I mean, you have an elderly American who passes away in a foreign country, and you've got to deal with helping the family get the body back. You have an American who's arrested, and you've got to be the point person to try to get that person the right kind of defense or out of the country. Economic issues, and by that, dealing with economic issues with countries. And again, we have a trade representative that negotiates most trade deals, but you know, the State Department plays a role here as well, and we do work a lot with other countries, either in assessing their economies or in helping them improve economies. So that's important. We do public affairs, and we call it public diplomacy, actually, which is a composite of press issues, very important, and cultural issues, which are usually exchange programs, also extremely important. I mean, any people-to-people program you would find in any embassy you served in overseas is going to be one of the most rewarding things that you were involved in. And then we have the political aspect, which is where you negotiate treaties. You might if you were at the UN, you'd be, or any multilateral organization, you'd be negotiating resolutions. It's where you deliver these wonderful messages to countries when we don't like how they're acting. Or you deliver a message asking them to be on board with you or be part of a coalition to defeat ISIL in Iraq. And that's considered the heady part, if you will, of the Foreign Service, the political cone, but the other cones are also very rewarding. Once you get into it, a few years in, you move around. I started my career as a public diplomacy officer. I ended up doing political work all toward the end, so. Yeah.
Our school is representing the UK in our conference in New York, and we wanted to get a better understanding, especially from your point of view, on their operations in the UN.
Okay. First of all, you know, our best allies, right? The United Kingdom. They're our best allies, but they're also our most fervent competitors. We in the UK compete a lot, and it's healthy. Push comes to shove, we're together on just about everything. But still, you know, one of us is out there trying to get the paper on the table first. You know, we want to be the first with this resolution. The UK does their homework very well spoken. I'm always enamored of how British diplomats present their interventions. They're extremely well trained, and I think it goes back not just to their diplomatic training, but probably their schooling as well. I think it's going through a period now, and many countries in the world talk about Security Council reform and say the current Security Council does not represent the world as it exists today. That's partly true. I won't deny that. The problem is what do you do differently? And nobody can come to agreement on who should come on the council as a permanent member. And I can tell you, it's unlikely that there'll ever be a discussion of who should come off as a permanent member, because the 5 permanent members have to ratify whatever decision is made, and the Russians aren't going to ratify coming off the council. The Chinese certainly aren't, and they're an emerging power. We're not going to do it, and I don't think France or the UK would do it. That said, the United Kingdom feels, and France to maybe a lesser extent, that it has to justify its place on the council today, which is why they're hyperactive. Hyperactive in organizing meetings, hyperactive in putting forth what we call products, if you will, at the Security Council, press statements, resolutions, etc., because they realize that they've got competition within Europe from Germany for a permanent seat. All of that said, as I said, we agree with them on most issues. There are very few issues where we in the United Kingdom and France as well would disagree. So, on major issues. Okay. Yes. Yeah.
I'm actually also a member of the Johnson County Community College on the United Nations team, the current president. I have a quick question on if you are representing your country as a foreign diplomat, would you only be able to represent your home country, or would you be able to, if you are being, say, naturalized, that you would be able to represent another country such as the United States?
Okay, I don't know how the U.S. works, but I do know that there are a number of ambassadors in New York who are U.S. citizens or dual citizens, but are representing X country. It's usually a smaller country. That said, they don't have diplomatic status or immunity. An American cannot have diplomatic status or diplomatic immunity working in one's own country. For the 6 years that I was in New York, I was considered by the UN a diplomat. I was a diplomat. I'm part of the diplomatic service, but I certainly didn't have immunity in my own country. There was no way. I didn't have a tax card. I didn't have all these things that my colleagues had from other missions. You're saying if you are a naturalized citizen, can you then represent your new country? Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. You just have to have that citizenship, and you don't have to have it for very long. Yes.
I want to work in the United Nations, but I'm foreign students. I want to work. Is there any advice for me? Because I have passion to work with the foreign countries, to be humanitarian, diplomat, not only for my country but for everyone.
I think you're well placed, because I suspect that you don't have a lot of Tajiks working within the UN system. The UN system has unofficial quotas for each country. They don't want preponderance of Americans working in their agencies, in the Secretariat, or British, or whatever. So I think you're probably well placed. I think that the two things that are very important is to map out, where you want to specialize, and what area, whether it be on, humanitarian affairs, or whether it is development work. And then also to have the support of your government, which is extremely important for getting a position within the UN Secretariat and the UN specialized agencies. So.
Thank you so much.
Yeah.
I'm sure everyone in the room understands the importance of networking. In your opinion, what have been the most beneficial connections that you've made in your work with the United Nations?
All right. Well, first of all, I try to do two things. It's very important when you work at the UN to know all the other delegations, right? And it's very important to attend their events. I mean, we all have our national days, Independence Days, etc. And it's noticed. When the United States doesn't show up, it's noticed. People know who you are, and it is considered a slight. So the networking among other diplomats is incredibly important. I found the networking among female diplomats to be essential, not just for dealing with women's issues, but for creating a relationship so that I could later call upon these women when I needed them on something. And we did a lot of that. We did a lot of networking, and it was extremely useful. The other thing is, and this is where I think it's very helpful for Americans, because we're in our own country, but you really can't do a lot of the issues at the UN if you don't have connections with American civil society. So you've got to keep that up as well. Whether it be the NGOs or the think tanks or the organizations that are keenly interested on an issue, that have knowledge and probably expertise that you, who cover many issues, do not have. and advocacy. And so that part is extremely important as well. So there's a lot of networking involved. It's a lot of work. So,
thank you.
And I also want to work with women and young girls issues around the country and even in America. And one of the questions that I have for you is, how do you work with a country that really doesn't see the value of like young girls and women? And how do you get that government to enact that change?
Thank you. It's a really good question and a really hard issue to deal with. I think what you have to do then is find the people who are sympathetic in that country, whom you can work with, and see if you can then make a difference with them. I've seen this now. I'll give you one example. We were very involved and still are very involved in New York in the issue of sexual violence used as a weapon of war. And the special representative, who's from Sierra Leone, she was Minister of Justice in Sierra Leone, and it was a fabulous choice that the Secretary General made to choose an African woman, a woman who was really a very prominent woman in her own country, was going around to the Democratic Republic of the Congo and to the Central African Republic and basically, beating up on leaders and saying, you know, this is wrong. And this is what's happening in your country, and I want to help you. I'm not here to humiliate you. I'm not here to go public with what I found, but I'm here to help you. And then she worked with people in the country. And in some cases, she's made some headroads. She has made some headroads in DRC in terms of accountability mechanisms. CAR is still quite a way to go, but it's not easy. Yeah.
I had a question concerning what the Foreign Service looks for in candidates. I mean, I would really enjoy being in the Foreign Service. I am myself a history major. I was wondering if that would be a hindrance or if they take more of a holistic view to, again, my involvement with such organizations as the United Nations Association as well as Modern United Nations.
I think they definitely take a holistic view. I think what they're looking for bright individuals who demonstrate flexibility, who have good communication skills, at least good ones to build on, who have a keen interest in foreign issues, if you will. I mean, you don't come into the Foreign Service with already a set knowledge of international affairs and what areas you want to work in necessarily, but with some sort of genuine interest in other societies and cultures. So,
thank you.
Please.
My question is, I have many students, about 50%, that are military dependents. And the United Nations projects that we've been involved in have stretched their families thin. Is there anything on the table for the near future that would allow other nations to take more of the military action as UN forces, rather than just using U.S. forces?
It's a good question. I think the problem is the following, that UN peacekeepers have a mandate to keep the peace. So it's very hard for them to go where there is no peace. They can't maintain peace that doesn't exist. Now, we've seen in the case of, for example, the DRC, we had a rapid reaction force. We really did have peacekeepers going in, special forces going in knocking heads. That doesn't happen that often. We're trying to replicate something like that in Central African Republic, but it's a bit difficult. But the French were sort of playing that role. And what we've found has worked in many instances is a country or a group of countries might do the very difficult peace enforcement part, and then the UN comes in to do the more peacekeeping part, that is maintaining, at least if there's an agreement, and even if it's being violated, they're trying to hold people to the agreement. So I think it would be very difficult to find the peacekeepers that would do this sort of thing, and we've had a lot of pushback from peacekeepers now already saying, it's too robust a mandate. We're going to places that we've never heard of. We're losing lives. Our forces aren't trained to the same degree. So it would be a little difficult. It would be wonderful if we could, but it would be difficult. What I think we need to do, though, just as a personal point of view, is that we just need more partners.
Thank you.
Okay.
And I was wondering if you could tell us a bit what you would consider your most memorable moment working with the Foreign Service would be?
Okay, there are a lot of them. But I think for me the most memorable moment was working on the status of Kosovo. And I think you all know that in 1999, because of the actions of Milosevic, which constituted ethnic cleansing, the United States and its NATO allies intervened to stop the bloodshed. And then Kosovo was put under UN administration. And that administration lasted a very long time. And almost 10 years. And I was, at the time, working in the Bureau of European Affairs. I was a Deputy Assistant Secretary for the region known as Southeastern Europe. And was involved in the negotiations on Kosovo's status. I think it was apparent to all of us, and we thought to the Russians as well. In fact, they were very clear that there was no other option but to make Kosovo an independent country. And then all of a sudden, Vladimir Putin did an about-face and didn't want to go forward with UN action that would have allowed this. And the way it would have allowed it was to have ended the UN administration. The UN doesn't make countries independent. Other nations recognize their independence or their status. And so we were blocked. And then it became very obvious that for security reasons, there was no option but to recognize Kosovo. And so I had been working with the Europeans, France, UK, Germany, and Italy. We were part of a small group. Russians used to be part of that group. There were 6 of us. We were down to 5, and the Russians, as I said, changed their minds. And we did a lot of lobbying. We went all over Eastern Europe. I went all over Europe. I did lots of traveling, lots of lobbying. And sure enough, Kosovo declared independence, and now I think it's 105 countries have recognized it. So it was a pretty memorable moment to see a country, a group of people who had suffered so much to actually finally gain independence, to be able to hoist a flag of its own, and to have its own institutions. So.
My question was, how did you have that balance act? As you noted earlier, family was important, but at the same time, you also, of course, wanted to work with the United Nations, and I have an interest in working with the United Nations. But I think also for me, I think I would want to put family first. So for someone like me, what kind of jobs, what can I look for when I'm looking at working at the United Nations?
Yeah. I think if you want to do UN work and you try to stay in New York, or you try to stay in like one place, you can do that. Now there is a policy now, and totally understandable, that to really be a good UN civil servant, you've got to go abroad. You've got to go see what a peacekeeping operation is like, or what conflict is like in certain parts of the world. But there are ways to do it. If you're foreign service, it's very hard. I spent more time in Washington than I probably should have or would have liked to be very honest. But it was a way of staying together. I had the good fortune of, when I came to New York, my husband also got a job in New York, so it worked out well for us. And frankly, one of the reasons why I decided retirement was the option now is that I didn't want another separation. So, thanks.
Hi, my name is Ricardo. I'm from I was wondering, when a country has violated the civil rights of its people, not to the, not like in Kosovo when they lost the ethnic cleansing, but it's still doing civil rights violations. What can the UN do to hold that country accountable?
Thank you. It's the most, I think that's one of the most difficult problems we deal with at the UN today. Because there are many countries, and powerful ones, who feel that it is not the business of others how a country deals with its citizens, with particularly citizens who are dissenting. They have a view of what I would call kind of ultimate sovereignty, that sovereignty allows you to do anything. That's not how we look at things. You know, a country can't, you can't abuse your citizens. You can't violate the rights of your citizens. You can't do what Assad has done in Syria and expect that to get a pass. It's just as simple as that. That said, if you want to have the UN holding these leaders accountable or governments accountable, you've got to have the support of others. Some cases you can get that. In some cases, it's next to impossible. Now, what can the UN do? You can vote in Geneva at the UN Human Rights Council. You can vote a resolution that condemns a country. You can set up a commission of inquiry to look further into the violations. But you really can't do anything that's going to change things, I'm sorry to say. I mean, maybe for some countries, naming and shaming is enough, but for most, if you're already violating the rights of your citizens to the point where you're throwing people in jail, you're torturing them, etc., you're not going to really care about a resolution that was adopted in Geneva. If you want to have sanctions, if you want to even have some kind of intervention to protect civilians, as we got for Libya, you need Security Council approval. And I can tell you there are 2 countries on the Council today that are very reluctant to approve that kind of action, even as sanctions. They both have vetoes, so that makes it a little difficult. There's a 3rd country coming on in January, not with a veto, country you know well, that I would say also would not be supportive of such action. So, thanks.
I was just curious how organizations like the U.S. Council on Foreign Relations or the Wolfowitz military doctrine has affected you as a diplomat?
Well, organizations like the U.S. Council on Foreign Relations, first of all, you know, the Council on Foreign Relations issues a number of reports that are useful, not necessarily something that everybody agrees with often, but does roundtables that are extremely helpful. I mean, the council, that both in New York and in Washington, is able to bring in not only Americans, but diplomats from other countries, provide a kind of neutral setting for discussion, which is very, very helpful, off-the-record session often. And then you're talking about the Wolfowitz military doctrine?
Yes.
Well, how has it affected me as a diplomat? It's out there. You know, I think there are many doctrines and many things, and the only thing I can say is that every situation is different, and we apply different remedies, if you will, different ways of dealing with different. I mean, in some cases it's different concerns or even the same concern. So, thanks.
And I just had a question. I remember maybe a few months back reading an article about Putin and Russia moving into Ukraine, and the article was actually comparing Putin's actions to Hitler's actions in Poland. How do you feel about such allegations?
Well, I think we have to be very careful about our rhetoric, to be very honest. I don't like what the Russians are doing. I don't think any of us is happy. Having spent 7.5 years of my life in Moscow, I'm very, very sorry for the Russian people and what they're going through. I think it's unfortunate. I think they deserve better. I'm sorry it's taken this kind of turn, and I'm very sorry our relationship is not, going in the path I'd like to see it move in. I think we have to hold the Russian government accountable when they do things like annex, Crimea, when they intervene in Ukraine. I think we have to call a spade a spade. But I think we have to not exaggerate, and I think we have to realize the fact we've got to work with them. We've got to find a way to work with them. We have worked with them on a range of issues over the years. Even in the Cold War, we worked with them. We did disarmament treaties together. We worked with them on counterterrorism. We worked with them on counterproliferation. We've got a lot of threats that are threatening both of us. We have to find a way to work with them. And I think if we allow ourselves to fall into metaphors and illusions and comparisons and things that are going to certainly smart the other guy, I think it's not going to necessarily help us move forward. I'm not saying we excuse anything, but I do think we have to think about the long term. So.
Thank you, Madam Ambassador.
Good evening. Like I said earlier, I really want to be part of the Foreign Service. What route did you take to enter the Foreign Service, and would you recommend that to a soon-to-be college graduate?
First of all, I've had a very checkered career. Nobody should follow my career, which went like this, okay? Partly because I wasn't sure what it's not that I wasn't sure what I wanted to do, I wasn't sure I could do it, I think. And so I was moving this way. I got a graduate degree in Russian literature. I like literature, and it got to the point where I knew while I was doing my graduate studies that I did not want to teach. I was sitting in a seminar given by a rather well-known professor of Russian literature on metaphor and metonymy in the works of Nikolai Gogol. And I decided I could not spend the rest of my life doing that. So I went off to Paris, and I was trying to finish my dissertation because there was a sense of pride that if I went that far, I had to get the degree. Fell into a job at UNESCO, which I loved, realized as much as it was interesting that at that point I could do much more if I joined my country's national foreign service, and I did. And then again, as I said, I did the jobs that I wanted to do, and I gave up some jobs even if I wanted to do them for family reasons. But I would say that the path that you follow is certainly one where do the kinds of things you want to do before you join. If there are things you want to do, you have time, and do that. But certainly have in the back of your mind, things that are going to help you either make a decision to move forward and join the Foreign Service, or help you get in by learning more about other countries, learning foreign languages.
If there's a major issue in a developing country and this country doesn't want the UN to come in and solve the issue, what action does the UN take if these countries doesn't listen but people are really suffering? Does the UN use force, or?
It's a good question. First of all, most of the time the UN wants to be invited in, and that's reasonable because one, they can actually achieve something, two, it's far less dangerous. There are times when the Security Council will adopt what we call a Chapter 7 resolution that allows someone to go in, use force, do certain things. And that has happened. Often, the Chapter 7 resolution that allows the use of force has the implementers are not the UN. The implementers are a group of member states that get together. That's what happened in Libya. A coalition of the willing, if you will, that went in to protect civilians. That's what happened in Bosnia. That's what happened, has happened elsewhere. Certainly, in the case of Afghanistan, we didn't have a Security Council resolution because we claimed self-defense and collective self-defense. So we actually followed the UN Charter. And again, I can tell you at the time the Taliban did not want us in Afghanistan. So.
Okay. Thank you.
Okay.
When connecting external debt sustainability and the issue of the developed nations as of right now not paying up to their dues that they've agreed to, how do you see the developing world moving forward with that? And from a European American point of view, how are we going to go about that?
I missed the first part of what you said.
The first part is external debt sustainability, looking at the developed nations and their obligation as to their own willingness to pay up to the United Nations dues that they agreed to.
I think the problem we have today in a lot of developing countries is the whole issue of good governance. And without the good governance, you're not going to have the development. And good governance is also paying their dues, but it's also having the kinds of structures, the anti-corruption measures, if you will, that will allow many of us to help them. And there's a long road to take on that, I would say. If I could just go back to the question about what happens if something terrible is happening in a country, but the country doesn't want the UN in. Let me give you one example, an issue that we wrestled with in the spring. And this was on humanitarian assistance to Syria. Syrian government was not letting the UN go to areas that the government did not control. So all UN assistance, and we were giving huge amounts of money, was going to areas controlled by the government. So the areas that were controlled by the insurgents, the rebels, whatever you want to call them, not ISIL, because ISIL's been sort of a relatively new phenomenon. UN assistance wasn't going there, the government was blocking it. There are provisions in international law that say if a government's starving its people, you do have the right to go in and force delivery. Problem is the following: you can't do that without military convoys. You can't do that without a military support around you. And there was nobody to provide that support. So.
You just recently mentioned ISIL, and I was just wondering what in your opinion, do you think the United Nations next step should be in dealing with ISIL?
I think we've done pretty well at the moment with the session that was chaired by Secretary Kerry in September. The U.S. had the presidency of the council, so we organized a lot of meetings on issues that we thought were important. He cleverly got a statement from the council that encouraged and urged states to provide humanitarian and military support to Iraq to combat ISIL. I think it's absolutely key that we get more countries involved in both providing the kind of humanitarian support that's needed, but also, frankly, aspect. And I know not everyone has the capacities we do, but people do have equipment. We need that. ISIL is now, they're targeted on the terrorist list, but we've got to expand it. We've got to get individuals on the list as well. They're targeted as a group now with some individuals that we know about. We've got to do more of that, just to freeze the funding going to them, to freeze the travel of some of these guys. Because they're coming from all parts. Some of them, we've got Americans fighting with them, but they're coming from all over the place. And I think the visibility has to be raised. We did it with Al-Qaeda, and we've got to do it with ISIL.